1, 2, 3, 4, 1.
I met Hal on Pine. I was 17. They needed a female vocalist in the band, and so then he says, okay, we'll hire you without any audition or anything, just you're in. So I started singing with him on WCOU. I was married at 19.
Lenny was born into a very musical family. His mother and father at the time were pretty much the most esteemed musical couple in New England. They were playing country music, and that had just hit that region in popularity a few years before. So Lenny was born right into that, and from the time he was a toddler, he was showing a lot of natural ability for music.
I was living on a farm, and my mom and dad were on the road. And the kid on the farm had a guitar, and I started to play the guitar. When my dad came back off the road, I had learned a few chords, see? So I played the chords for him. He bought me a guitar.
We were traveling a lot, Pine and I, and these people loved our show, and they came to the studio and they said, we'd love to keep your children while you're traveling, So they were on a farm, and they had good care. And so anyway, Lenny, we had bought him a little guitar. And Lenny was listening to Hank Snow playing some kind of a little a little like a jig, And so he started rehearsing it. He was listening, And we were on the road for 2 weeks. We came back. He had it down pat and more, added more notes to it besides. My gosh, he had little small hands and reaching all over the place. We couldn't figure it out. I said, oh my gosh, he's really going to be a guitar player.
Lenny, as a young boy, and my brother Dick were included on the show as soon as they could. As soon as they were little peanuts, they were the noisiest kids in radio, and Lenny had a little washboard that he would play with a little bird that beep, beep, beep on it.
He used to travel with us and sing on stage, and we had a comedian, and he'd do a little comedy skit with the comedian. He was so funny on stage. We never knew what he was going to say. We had to be careful, because he had learned some swear words, and we had to be careful.
Well, actually, by the age of 8 years old, I was serious about it then. Because from even when I was 3 and 4, at times I was backstage. And I'd be digging all the guitar players all the time. Like my mom and dad had a guitar player with them back in those days. And I used to watch them all the time. So I knew that I wanted to play when I was 8, you see.
So, when you're touring on the road at 12 years old and you're being exposed to all these guitar players that are playing in all these bands, you're like a sponge at that age. And also, Lenny was just an innate genius. I mean, he just had a wonderful ear for music.
Back in the 50s, when Betty Cody and Hal Lone Pine were working out of Wheeling, West Virginia, they went on a traveling show that included Chet Atkins, who was a major star by then. And Lenny was not on this tour, but Betty Cody really played him up to Chet Atkins and was really extolling her son's virtues. And Chet was the ultimate gentleman. He may not have believed a word of it, but he smiled and said, "That's great. I'd love to meet your son one day."
RCA Victor had a tour to promote our records, and that's how Chet was on there. He was my backup man. He played guitar for me, and then he says, I hear your son, he was only 12 then, Lenny. He says, I hear that your son is going to be quite a guitar man. I says, well, he already is, and he loves you, Chet. I says, he really listens.
This is back in the 50s. And they'd go to New York, or they'd go to Nashville and do a recording session. And they'd tell him, listen, we got a young boy at home. He's really good, and like Chet said, oh, yeah, right, is that right? And like he'd send me a little autograph picture, look like good luck with your guitar playing and all that stuff. By the time I was 12, I started working with my dad. So by the time I was 15, I was in the band, like on the road. I left school in the ninth grade because I had to make up my mind whether I was going to play in the clubs at night or whether I was going to go to school because I was getting home pretty late, and uh, I just couldn't make it in school. Well, you see.
I think he was 14 years old, and I just thought he was going to strum on the guitar. I didn't look to him as being one of the lead musicians. When he started playing the guitar, it was like, wow, this kid has got it, I was watching him play, and fingerstyle, Travis and Chet style. He said, I think he brought up the idea. It could have been me, but we decided to turn on the tape machine, and I just put a microphone in front of him as a ribbon microphone, and he said, I played back the first couple of things that he did, and he said, hey, wow, sound like Chet. So the next thing I know, about an hour went by, and he was playing, and I just let it go. Some people said his father was kind of a tough guy to work for. I didn't have any problems with Hal. I could see where if he wanted to do a certain thing, and he said he's going to do it, he's going to do it, I think a couple of times I stepped on his toe, and I knew it when I suggested that maybe we should bring the tempo up a little bit on a number of that. No, I always do it this way, and that was it. And Lenny took the commands from his father and did it pretty well, just the way his father told him to do it. And he'd talk and he stuttered. He'd say things like, Al, do that again, play that again. And I'd play this thing back to him. And he said, no, that's good enough, I want to do something else. In other words, he heard it almost like he wanted to redo it, but he never did. Everything that he had on was just a one-take thing.
When Chet heard his first recording, I think it was from the time he had recorded for Al Hawks. And that's when he called me. Chet called me and he says, if your son is ready, he says, we'd love to have him in Nashville and play for, record for RCA.
Wow, and this is when he was still 15, 16 years
Yeah,
old?
yeah. But Lenny was not ready then to record. He wanted to experiment more on his playing.
I was running home from school every day to listen to Lenny play on CKY radio. The first time I heard him, I was just astounded, So they had a daily radio show, Monday through Friday, and I used to beetle out of school so I could get home at 4:30 and hear their show, So I was already like totally in awe of this young kid, Of course, I was a young kid myself, and but I was doing some work in dance halls. Actually, I was playing 6 nights a week and going to high school. So I don't know how I made it through that, but I did. And one day I got a phone call, and it was him. It was the man, on the phone. He said, hey, man, I heard you play on the radio, and I really dig your playing, man, Yeah. And I was just, I was so thrilled, Yeah. So he used to come over to my place and bring his guitar, and we'd set up and jam, That was kind of the beginning of our relationship.
Well, when I was 15 years old, I started listening to jazz guitarists, guys like Johnny Smith, Tal Farlow, and Barney Kessel, and those people. And I said, boy, I'd sure like to play that kind of music.
Any guitar player that's seeking to expand the creative platform is going to start listening to other styles and be enamored of them. And so when Lenny started listening to any of the jazz players of the time, it was just a logical progression. So while he was up on stage with his dad and mom playing all the Chet stuff and playing single line stuff, with a slight jazz leaning. You know, if you chromatically enhance a major scale, it can sound like country, but it really is a jazz technique, so to speak.
He just couldn't just stick to country. And Yellow and Pine was singing, I don't think it was Oh Lonesome Me, I think, I'm not sure.
So to liven things up a little bit, he would throw in these jazz riffs into country tunes. And he was warned not to.
Oh, Lone Pine didn't have the ear that Lenny had.
He took a bebop chorus on some country tune, and backstage his father slapped him.
Because that was sort of a falling out between he and his dad. This is the slap heard around the guitar world.
And Lenny figured, hey, I don't have to stand for that.
By the time I was 18, I had met some jazz players, so I went down and started playing bass with them. You know, electric bass. And then I left my dad's band and I got into jazz, and I've been in it ever since.
In order to play jazz well at the level that he wanted, in order to play bebop, you really have to understand some basic precepts of music. And you can't totally rely on your ear. And Lenny had an incredible ear, but your ear is not necessarily going to tell you how many scales are available to play over a certain altered chord. And that's the kind of thing that Lenny wanted to know. He was a melodic improviser. He was playing. When he joined the Union in Winnipeg, and he got sent out to play with little pickup bands. And most of the guys playing in these bands were older men and were jazz musicians. And Lenny was faking it. He was playing by ear. He was playing little melodic riffs and just doing his best to keep up with them, but in a very classy, tasteful way. One of these musicians, Bob Erlandson, who was a very, very experienced jazz musician and a brilliant musician in his own right, connected with Lenny and saw Lenny's potential, and he and Lenny became very, very tight. And Bob just showed him everything. And Lenny, it seemed like there wasn't really almost a learning process. Bob would tell him something, and Lenny could do it almost immediately.
Nobody had ever talked to Lenny about any theory. And certainly not learning how to read. So I helped him to start reading by just reading chord symbols. But then I had to teach him all the fancier chords. And he always asked all these good questions, and I'd have to say, well, I can't answer that. And I have to look it up in books and check it in the library and stuff, and then be able to tell him the next day what I'd found out. And some of it meant hands-on things where I've never become a guitar player, but because of my own personal research, I had figured out a bunch of things that nobody had ever showed him. And a non-guitar player shouldn't necessarily teach a guitar player, except that I had ideas that were coming out of piano that I could put onto the guitar and show him how to do it, and then let him grasp what I'm talking about, and over the next 2 weeks figure out how to demonstrate for me later on that he did understand, and here's how it applies.
It was like going to school for me, because I worked in a jazz club for 2 years at a time. I had 6 nights a week. So I was learning every day, and I was practicing during the day,
But he hooked up with a really extraordinary fellow named Don Franks, who was a singer and entertainer and so on, and they formed a group with a bass player named Ian Henstridge called Three. And the music they played was a mixture of things, heavy on the jazz, but other things as well. And they did a number of gigs in Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, and then they got booked for some shows down in New York and made an album down there. But it was fairly short-lived.
Oh yeah, but then there's another part that goes da 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 da. She goes da 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 da, right the bad little thing.
Don Franks was also an actor, and that's what he's best known as now. He's a very well-known Canadian actor, and when he was in New York, he auditioned for a show, and just went with it. I mean, he and Lenny, the thing that they shared was that they were both creative free spirits. And I think Lenny was probably disappointed by it because they really had started to go somewhere. Lenny would have been 20, 21 years old. He was really young. The band was not a huge commercial success. I mean, it was, you know, it was getting some attention, but it would have been a very difficult band to pigeonhole.
They'd ended up in New York City, and Don got offered a Broadway show. So he broke up the trio. Ian Hendrich, being smart enough, immediately, with the little bit of money he had left, got on the bus and went back to Toronto. Lenny stayed in New York and spent all his money and pawned his guitar and amp. So he phones me in Winnipeg, and he said, like Bob, I got no money and I got no job because Don's got this Broadway show to do. And I pawned my instruments. And I said, now, a spooky thing has just happened, Lenny. I've been hired at the Towers for the last 4 weeks. When he phoned, I said, you got a gig, I got some money, I'm sending you a plane ticket. I went to a music store and bought an ES-125 guitar, and I'd already owned an Ampeg amplifier for my bass playing. And so when Lenny got off the plane, I could hand him a guitar and tell him that the amplifier is at my house. And we start on Monday.
When Lenny went to Toronto, he made a demo tape. There was a great rock and roller, an American rockabilly player named Ronnie Hawkins, who was the center of pretty much the center of Toronto's music scene, ran a club called Cockdoor. Ronnie Hawkins recommended these players from his band, Levin Hellman and Rick Danko, who went on to become quite famous as the band, playing with Bob Dylan and big 60s band at the time, or later on, several years later. And so it was recorded over a period of 2 days, and there were some band things, and then there was Lenny playing some solo things as well. As far as I know, they were all one-take things, and just probably discussing the changes. And the guys who played with them, Levin Hellman, Rick Danko, were similar kinds of musicians to Lenny. These guys were people who could play anything, and I have to tell you, when I was talking to George Sikornik and doing research for the book, and he just happened to mention this in passing, and he said, "Oh, I've got those tapes, and they're in my wine cellars." And I just thought it sounded like an extraordinary thing, but I didn't know how extraordinary it would be. I expected to hear somebody who sounded like they were fumbling through some jazz changes, and when I heard that Levin Helm and Rick Danko were doing it, I knew these guys as rock and roll musicians, but they were an amazing trio, and Lenny was just absolutely blazing. You know, he was working out his indulgences. By that I mean Lenny was about 20 or 21 years old and discovering what his abilities were, and sometimes you can hear him overplaying a little bit on that and just kind of delighting in being able to do those things technically rather than, you know, making great musical statements. But there's enough great musical statements to really be very impressive.
He was doing a trio in Manitoba, in Winnipeg, with Ray St. Germain, called Hop or something, Youth Hop.
From Winnipeg, your afternoon music hop presents Hoot Nanny with Ray St. Germain.
And they used to feature Lenny.
what they were doing was were playing versions of popular songs at the time. That really gave Lenny a very, very high profile. Turn on the TV expecting to see some little regional show, and you would hear this guitar player that was, even at that point, was probably one of the best guitar players in the world.
Lenny Breau is a great guitarist. As a matter of fact, there are people who say he is one of the greatest in the entire world. Here's why. Lenny Breau.
It sounded like a two-handed piano player, although it was just his left hand. And he had developed that totally on his own. He was just unique. He had obviously studied people like, Chet Atkins and the other masters of the guitar, but he had his own ideas of what he wanted music to sound like, which had come from Bill Evans and other jazz people and who knows what. And he had decided that he was going to make that happen on guitar somehow, and he, with his genius, did it. He made the guitar sound like no one else had before.
Lenny Breau.
I was doing a show, let me see, it was out of Winnipeg. And it was my own show. It was called the Lenny Breau Show. There was me on it, and I had I think there was a couple of girls on it, looked like singing too. And somebody heard that show. They were traveling through with the Grand Ole Opry, and this guy that played guitar was a friend of Chet's, and he says, well, give me a tape of that show, like just the sound, And he brought it down and played it for Chet, and Chet heard it and, flipped out.
Lenny Breau will be back in 1 minute.
When Lenny was ready, he called Chet, and Chet paid for his airplane drive, everything, and he said. So it was an amazing thing to see Lenny come out of the plane and with his little guitar and walk up to the RCA studios, and Chet was so amazed all the time,
For years, Lenny had been saying, I want to do this album, but I don't feel ready. And then he had been away from Winnipeg. He wasn't living in Winnipeg because we hadn't played together for a year. And then out of the blue, he phoned and said, I'm ready. I'm going to do the album. I spoke to Chet. This was in 1968. And so I want you and Reg to do it with me. And I was, very flattered because we hadn't played together for so long, and he'd been all over the country consorting with all manner of probably very good musicians. But anyway, the three of us had something. You know, we had an empathy, and that's what he wanted.